It was really great.
All right,
I
so
went off the third story one day. So some dude's parents or something throw them off or some shit.
we stopped by talking about the. I think you got it. I think you didn't get the roll sheet over here, but did you? You did. You did or didn't get it? Here, I'll get it. We stopped talking about the attempt to fix utilitarianism or the problems associated with utilitarianism by creating rules. So the purest form of utilitarianism is act utilitarianism. And this attempt to fix it, I said one of the things that we can do when we watch the How Ethical is the Chocolate in Your Easter Basket, you could say from an act utilitarian perspective, if we enslave a small number of people and it creates all greatest happiness, well, then isn't that a good thing? And you could justify slavery on those grounds. So rule utilitarianism, says, well, look, we can't have slavery because you'd start, well, we're going to enslave this small group of people for this, or this small group of people for this, and we're going to all be happier. So we try to come up with rules. The problem with even rule utilitarianism is that you could come up with rules that allowed for slavery, right? That were based on reason. You could come up with rationales that meet at least a minimum of a logical test where you have means end. This is called a rational basis test, where you just have some nexus between the means and the end. You can come up with rules that still allow for this, that justify the means and the end. The second problem is that how do you calculate happiness? In very simple situations, it's pretty easy to calculate happiness, right? I told you I had a colleague who used to throw erasers at people's head. Well, that's not creating happiness. It was creating happiness for her. I think she enjoyed that. But it didn't create, that's a pretty straightforward situation. But when we get into complex situations, and particularly complex economics, for example, does anybody really understand the way the world economy works? I mean, when I ask students, for example, things like, what backs up the United States dollar? What backs up the US dollar? No. We went off the gold standard in 1973.
Treasury bond.
Nope. It's worth whatever anybody thinks it's worth, right? It's called fiat money. There's nothing that backs it up. It's worth whatever, and it floats every day. You can see the price of the dollar against the Japanese yen or the euro. It's worth whatever it's totally arbitrary. It's psychologically driven. Billions and trillions of dollars circle the globe in what might be thought of. And economists, I had this whole debate with one of the economists one time about virtual money, and he insisted there was no such thing, and there is virtual money. It circles the globe in currency trading every day. George Soros bankrupted the Mexican economy in one day in something called the tequila effect. When you're dealing with these kinds of complex systems, how is it ever possible to calculate overall happiness? If one economy's currency fails and people make lots of money off of it, and overwhelmingly in the developed world we benefit, it's really hard to do the calculus on things like that. The other problem is that even with rule utilitarianism, can you develop a rule for every situation? Yes, in most situations, the idea of rule utilitarianism is that we can, in most instances, calculate a rule that deals with things, because the range of human experience is such that it's not really all that unique. Most interactions are pretty mundane and pretty routine. But there are unique circumstances. And there are, for example, in law, what we call cases of first impression. And so, what do you do in those situations where you don't have a rule? You haven't thought about it, right? It becomes problematic. Now, the nice thing about rule utilitarianism is you know what the rule is, you look at the rule, you go to the book or whatever it is, and you know what the answer is, right? So again, there are problems with each of the ethical theories. None of them are perfect. These are, of course, valid because they at least meet those three criteria. So how do we calculate happiness? The ends don't always justify the means. In response to that, we get duty ethics. So if we think of this in terms of Hegelian dialectic, you start out with a thesis, right? A thesis is an idea. In response to the thesis, you'll get an antithesis, which I had a high school teacher tell me was pronounced antithesis. That's what it looks like, but it's pronounced, the correct pronunciation of the word is antithesis. That's part of my Oklahoma to English dictionary, antithesis. It's really in normal speak, antithesis. And if these two stay around long enough, you'll get a synthesis. And the synthesis will become a thesis, and there will be a response to that, and the dialectic continues. Okay? So, duty ethics is the antithesis of utilitarianism. Duty ethics says that you can't look at what happens. You cannot look at the circumstances surrounding an event and determine whether or not somebody is a good moral actor. Let's take a very simplistic example of this to illustrate the problem with utilitarianism and why duty ethics is somewhat attractive. How many of you have done something in your life that you thought would turn out really, really wonderful for all involved, and it was an absolute nightmare? Mm-hmm. Almost everybody has done this. I remember as a young kid, I got it because I was up. I was one of these early children. My mother had a pediatrician that she took us to who termed this, and I don't know if this was his theory or not, but he said all children are either owls or larks. Larks are birds that rise early, and owls are birds that obviously hunt at night, right? They've got big eyes so they can see things, and they hunt primarily at night. Larks are early risers. My brother was an owl, by the way. So my mother, this was problematic for her because she had one child that was up at 5 a.m. and another that wasn't going to bed until 5 a.m. So I remember one weekend I thought, I don't know how old I was, 6, maybe 5 or 6. And my grandfather had started to teach me how to cook. I like to cook. So I thought, well, I'll make breakfast for my parents. And before you know it, the kitchen is a complete and utter disaster area. And I had started to fry bacon, and that led to a minor grease fire. And it turned out poorly, right? For all involved. The smoke detector went off. My parents were awakened. There's this grease fire. Luckily, we got it out, but it turned out poorly. The intention was good, but a utilitarian would say that you were a horrible person because you disrupted your parents' sleep, you woke the entire household up, and things turned out badly. So therefore, that was a bad act. A duty ethicist would say, look, the intent, the mind was good, right? There's nothing in the world so good as a good mind. And you had good intentions. And you shouldn't be held responsible, morally culpable, because things turned out poorly. So duty ethics takes on 2 forms. Again, I told you that we can answer these 3 great questions, the question of knowledge, the question of conduct, the question of governance. We can answer those questions not using philosophy. We can use religion as a way of answering these questions. And so duty ethics takes 2 forms. The oldest form is called religious absolutism. How are you going to determine what the rules are for religious absolutists? Well, you're going to turn to the book. Go to the book, look at what the book says, and follow the rules. Which, by the way, in the monotheistic tradition, religious absolutism is actually relatively modern. phenomenon. This idea of fundamentalism is a really very contemporary idea. We have 5,000 years in the Jewish tradition of not being fundamentalist, and about 1,800 years in the Christian tradition of not being religiously absolutist. This idea of turning to the book and looking at the book and applying it absolutely in those traditions is very, very, very contemporary. It's not so contemporary in Islam, and it's not necessarily contemporary in other religions. But in Judaism and Christianity, religious absolutism is a very, very contemporary phenomenon. But it's an older tradition in some other philosophies, right? So what are we going to do? We're going to turn to the book. We're going to look at the book. Well, what does the book say? The problem with religious absolutism is obviously whose book are we going to use, right? In the United States, well, I guess we would, since we are primarily a Christian nation, we would turn to the Christian Bible, right? And look at the book. Well, there's a problem with that. Which version of the Bible are we going to use? There's all kinds of different versions of the Bible, right? The Catholics have a different version than the Christians. The first Christian Bible, well, Catholics are Christians, but Protestant Christianity, well, I guess the King James Version, the New International Version. There are lots of rules in the Bible. Should apply them absolutely, right? This might be problematic. What does it say in the Old Testament we should do in Leviticus with incorrigible children? They're supposed to be stoned, right? Leviticus 18:20, if a man lies with a man as he with a woman, they've committed an abomination, their blood should surely be upon them. If you go a few verses above or below that verse in Leviticus, it's also an abomination to wear linen and wool together. It's an abomination to eat a rabbit. It's an abomination to eat shrimp. So should we stone everybody in here? Because I don't eat shrimp. I mean, this might not be such a good idea, right? So you can see what the problem with religious absolutism is that, you're going to have different books, different versions of the book, different interpretations of the book. So Kant comes up with rational absolutism. And what Kant says is that you have to act in such a way as to be able to will that your action would be a universal maxim of law. So it has to be absolutely logically consistent, universally applicable, and completely non-emotive. Well, what's a law that we could come up with from Kant's formulation of the categorical imperative? Always treat another rational being as an end and never as a means to an end. Well, you can't sort of recite Kant's categorical imperative, which, by the way, you get this in his three greatest works. So Kant's three major works are the Critique of Practical Reason, the Critique of Pure Reason, and the Metaphysics of Morals. So in the Critique of Practical Reason, Kant talks about hypothetical imperatives. So there are three critiques that Kant comes up with. Critique the second critique is the Critique of Pure Reason, and then the Metaphysics. Kant says there are two types of imperatives. There are hypothetical imperatives, and he talks about this, I believe, in the Critique of Practical Reason, and there are categorical imperatives. What's a hypothetical imperative? A hypothetical imperative is one that is brought about as a result of some desire, and it may or may not have moral import to it. What's a hypothetical imperative that all of you have in this room? Well, you're here at 8 o'clock in the morning as you're yawning and you're tired and you'd rather not be here because you want something which is a better career. You've been told that if you want to make a good living and have a good chance at achieving at least middle class status, you should go to college and get a degree, right? That's why you're here. That's a hypothetical imperative. If you want a chance at a better life, you should get a college degree. That doesn't carry a lot of moral import. Lots of people might say, I don't really care about achieving middle class status. I just want to, live in a, little house on a couple of acres and be left alone. I don't need to make a lot of money. I can buy me a mobile home, and a shotgun and shoot rabbits. Live out, like they did 150 years ago. Grow some crops, you can do that pretty cheaply. Can goods, save them up. Not anything terribly moral or immoral in that. That's what you want. That's what your goal is. Most of you, that's not what your goal is, right? You don't want to live in a mobile manufactured home out on 2 acres at the edge of town and shoot rabbits or squirrel or whatever else it is that you want to eat, right? Most of you want to be able to go to the grocery store and buy food that has been processed for you and not have to worry about it. How many of you, anybody garden in here? No? Yes, your father does. And it fascinates me that he does this and then he doesn't eat any of it, right? I mean, he gardens, he grows all this stuff and then he doesn't eat it. Because he doesn't like vegetables, apparently. It's just a hobby. Just to see if you can do this. I find that really interesting. Most people who garden do it because they like fresh vegetables. Right? I like fresh vegetables too, but I'm inherently lazy, so I want to go to the store and buy them. And there's not much difference between freshly grown. The one exception to that is tomatoes. Tomatoes are absolutely, store-bought tomatoes are generally horrible. And the reason for that is that they grow them in large warehouses. In fact, we now buy more tomatoes from, I believe, Canada than we do from Mexico. They grow them in huge greenhouses. Canada's got lots of land like the United States, and there's not much up there. And isn't this just the perfect climate? They do have sunshine, so grow them in a greenhouse. And you can grow tomatoes, and then they gas them so that they turn them red. They fill the greenhouses with carbon dioxide, and it turns the fruit red. And the reason they do that is, as I understand it, is because you can then ship it, and you've got this nice red tomato, but it stays fresh longer because it's not, if you get the tomato that's really fine ripened, and this is a highly perishable product, it doesn't last as long on the shelves. So in the transportation, you're losing valuable time, and that's a highly perishable good. So do this, and that's one of the reasons that they have absolutely almost no flavor when you buy them at the grocery store. But other things pretty much taste like they should. I'm pretty good, and I don't want to grow zucchini. I like zucchini and broccoli and things like that. And quite frankly, I couldn't grow it enough for all of the stuff that we eat a lot of vegetables in my household. And I guess I could have a greenhouse and grow it, but it would be hard. It would be difficult, particularly in the winter months. And I want to go to the grocery store and pick it up, right? So most of us want something better. Not terribly. There's nothing immoral or moral about that hypothetical imperative, right? You have a desire, and so you go to college. I went to college. because that's what my parents said, you need to go to college if you want to get a good degree, if you want to get a good job. Went to college, became a lawyer, and then I became a college professor. And so that's just, beyond morality for the most part. Categorical imperatives, on the other hand, are ones that do have moral import. We have lots of laws, for example, that even criminal laws that are based on hypothetical imperatives that have no moral import. The speed limit in the parking lots, for example, is what?
10 miles an
I
hour.
think it's 10 miles an hour. Why do we have that? Why do we have that hypothetical imperative? If you violate it, we don't say you're an evildoer, but the whole reason that we do it is because we don't want people being mowed down in the parking lots by reckless drivers as they're walking to class, right? So we have this criminal rule that says obey the speed limit, even though there's not a lot of moral import to that. Is there any moral import to the speed limit being 35 out on 2nd Street, which I think is it 35 or is it 25?
I think it's 40, but people drive 25.
Well, I think one way is
1
40,
million?
one way is 30.
West is 40 and it's 30 east on the same road.
Huh.
I've noticed that too. I didn't
Wow.
think those real those.
That makes almost no sense, but it seems to me that. But there's not a lot of moral import to that. If you go 41, you're technically violating the rule, but we obey the rule because we want to have traffic safety, right? So always treat another rational being as a means to an end, as an end in and of themselves, never as a means to an end. Well, what does that mean? And why do I say this is, you can't recite it and start to sort of laugh after you've had a glass of wine or two? Well, according to Kant, one of the things, if you're going to treat people as rational beings, as an end in and of themselves, you could never lie. Never, ever lie. Never, ever, ever lie. Why can you not lie? Because when you lie to somebody, you're manipulating them. And you are denying them their autonomy. Generally speaking, you lie because you want to achieve some goal. Unlike some people who have been caught in over 10,000 lies, and there seems to be no reason for those lies other than just has a absolute aversion to the truth. Most people, when they lie, there are people that are compulsive liars. They just, not capable of telling the truth. And it doesn't seem to do anything for them. They just can't help themselves. But most of us, when we lie, that we're not compulsive liars. Why are you lying? Why did you lie as a child? How many of you know who Lucas? Let me see what his name is. Gotta look it up. On my phone, isn't it great to have information at your fingertips if you can find the right app? There it is. There it is. Lucas Graham. How many of you know who Lucas Graham is? Only one person?
The singer?
He's a singer, yeah. He has a song called Mama Said. Anybody listen to that song? It's like one of the funniest songs I've ever heard in my entire life. And it's really, he's got these little kids in the background, which are probably computer generated, that are saying, Mama said that it's okay. It's like the funniest thing. You should listen to the song. But your mama said, don't eat cookies before dinner. How many of you, like, Mama said, don't, You're a little kid, most little kids want sugar, right? They're kind of sugar addicts. Most people are sugar addicts. And why didn't your parents want you to eat cookies before dinner? You'd be jumping out, well, and you also fill up on cookies, and there's cookies taste good, but there's no nutritional value there, or very little nutritional value there. And so they want you to eat your fruits and your vegetables and your protein at dinner. And so if you fill up on cookies, you're not going to do that. And how many of you would get into the cookies and eat the cookies, and then your parents, what happened to the Oreos? I don't know. The dog ate the Oreos. Well, you're lying because you want to manipulate your parents, because you want to avoid getting into trouble for not following the edicts of their rules, right? You're manipulating them. You're not allowing them. And if your parents are stupid enough to believe you, you've done that. You've managed to manipulate them in such a way as to get what you wanted, and use them as a means to an end. For those of you who have siblings, you probably are more believable. You learned early on that, particularly if you had a younger sibling, you could blame it on the younger sibling and get away with stuff. You manipulated your parents, and now your younger sibling is being, beaten for getting into the cookie jar, although you can't do that anymore, right? I grew up in a time when people could still spank their children. My parents didn't, but that was common. They still spanked children in school, which my parents found abhorrent. How many of you went to a school where they paddled? Anybody still remember that? No. It was pretty common in Guthrie public schools that teachers would give swats for aberrant behavior. So you're manipulating people. Well, never lie. Never, ever, ever lie. Is it ever okay to lie? A lot of us would say, even though I consider myself a neo-Kantian, we would say, yeah, there are, you shouldn't lie frequently. But there are times when it is acceptable to lie. What are those times?
Say your wife is pregnant and am I fat or something like that.
Right, yeah, the little white lie, right? That's you don't say things like, "Oh my God, you look like a beached whale." No. I mean, you don't say things like that. Kant would say, yeah, you just have to be truthful. It may be the reason that I'm single and divorced, because I'm brutally honest. You look like hell in pastels. Go up and change. Kant would say, never lie. What about more directly related to marketing? Well, we engage in studies all the time, in drug trials, in which we lie to people in product development. Take this pill, it's going to do X for you, and we give them a placebo. And then we look and see whether or not there's a difference between the control group, which is the placebo group, and the experimental group. Right? That's common. Although we do it less, we're supposed to now engage, when we engage in that kind of research, we're supposed to say, you may or may not, we are not going to tell you which. But that's a sin of commission. Or, omission, not commission. It's a sin of omission, isn't it? We're not going to tell you. We're going to withhold information from you. Kant would say that's a lie, too. Can't do that. The other problem with Dooney ethics is that it doesn't provide us for any guidance with dealing with conflicting duties. What do we do if we have conflicting duties? For example, there's a duty, Kant says, not to lie, but you could also have a duty that says you have an obligation to the extent possible to not engage in something that would harm another rational being. So let's suppose, the Nazis are at the door. Where are the Jews? Well, now you've got two conflicting duties. You have a duty to preserve life, right? That's one of you could have this rational duty. You could say, but you also have this duty, Kant would say, well, you can't lie. When the Nazis can't, Anne Frank is in the attic. But now you're actively participating in the harming of another rational being, aren't you? So what do you do when you have conflicting duties? And there's no guidance for dealing with that. And most of us would say that result is just too harsh, right? So there's a third major theory. This is called virtue ethics, and this goes back to the ancients, and this goes to Aristotle. And Aristotle, in his most famous works, there are two that he does on ethics that are enormously important. And what you see in Aristotle is what most scholars consider the older work and less complete is the Eudaimonia ethics, and then the more complete and latter the Nicomachean ethics. Sir Anthony Kenny at Oxford, however, believes that the Nicomachean ethics came first and the Eudaimonia ethics is more complete. What you see in these works on ethics is a system of balance and proportionality that develops. So you start, for Aristotle, with the question, what is the good life? And in order to answer that question, you have to arrive at the terminus ad quem, which is the point at which it no longer makes sense to ask why. And I know my handwriting is horrible. The terminus ad quem. How many of you were why children? I find that lots of college students were why children. If you're attempting college, you obviously have some level of intellectual ability, particularly if you've gotten this far. You are in the educational elite of the world and the educational elite of the United States. It used to be that about 50% of our population that graduated or matriculated from high school attempted some degree of higher education. Not necessarily college, but VOTAC or something like that. The matriculation rates in the United States, by the way, have been abysmal in many places. There are now 2,000 districts across the nation where the matriculation rate has decreased to less than 50% of those that enroll in high school. That means that in those school districts, we have a 50% dropout rate. You want to know where some of those districts are? A lot of them are here in Oklahoma, unfortunately. It's horrible. And the numbers of people that are attending college have now decreased as well, along with that. I believe it's down to about 35 to 40%, depending on how you look at the numbers or which numbers you look at, of people that graduate from high school attempt some level of college. Now, everyone in this room, as a result of the fact that this is what level course, I believe this is a 4,000 level course, everyone in this room has to have had at least, I think, junior level standing now. You are probably marketing students or sales students. That means you're well on your way to graduating. Historically, again, 50% of our population attempted some level of higher education, and about 25 to 30% of the United States graduated with a college degree. We graduated more people with college degrees, by the way, than almost any other country. And it's because we allow people to have easy access to higher education compared to other places. When I was a foreign exchange student in Germany, they give you a high stakes test. At that time, I don't know if they still do this because I haven't been there in a long time. And that was still when there was a West Germany and East Germany, they were divided. But they give you a high stakes test. I believe that high stakes test is given in the 6th grade. And it determines whether or not you go to gymnasium, which is the college prep version of high school, or whether you're going to be somewhere else. And if you don't pass the test, that's it. There's just not a lot of hope for you. There's not a lot of opportunity for you to come back. In the United States, we offer lots of opportunity. Even if you don't graduate from high school, you can still redeem yourself and do what? You can get something called the GED, which is the equivalent of high school matriculation. And after you get the GED, if you test well enough, you can take the ACT, SAT, you can get into college. And if you don't test well enough on the ACT or SAT, what can you do to still redeem yourself? Well,
Your grade point average.
you can use the grade point average. You can use recommendation letters, or you can go to an open admission college. We have lots of these here in Oklahoma City. They're called community colleges now. They used to be called junior colleges. We have tons of them. Anybody in here go to a community college or junior college? Like, that's a pretty good choice, particularly if you graduated from Oklahoma City public schools, you could go to OCCC for free. You could get all of those lower level educational requirements out of the way at a community college for free at OTRIP. And even if you didn't graduate from Oklahoma City Public, it's still a lot cheaper than it is to even come to UCO. UCO used to be the low cost provider, but we're still more expensive than the community or junior college. So you can go to a community or junior college. You can take all of those lower level courses. If you didn't have all of the math courses that you needed, you can remediate and you can go on. That's not the way it works in a lot of other countries. And it was not the way it worked in West Germany when I was a foreign exchange student there. And it was a big disappointment. One of the families that were friends of the family that I stayed with, the husband and wife were both doctors. And they had kids that were just average. And they didn't make it. It was a big shock to them that their kids didn't make it into gymnasium. They were going to go do something else. But we let everybody have at least an opportunity. So you all are among the educational elite in this country. And so the terminus ad quem, why is it that you are getting a college education? Well, the answer is that you want that piece of paper so that you can go get a job at the end of this. That's at that point, well, why do you want to do that? Well, because you have to live, right? That's the terminus ad quem, right? Ultimately, you have to make a living and have a job. And that's the point at which it makes, you could be a why child. I was a why child. I would say, well, why do you want to live? Well, as we discussed in here in talking about Voltaire's Candide, most people want to live, right? Very few people take their own lives, and people cling to life even in the most dire of circumstances. Now, I would have still, as a child, I can tell you I was a why child, and I would still say, well, why? Why is that? And my mother would become completely exhausted with me, and she would say, Grant, you can't ride a dead horse. We grew up on a cattle ranch, and, and my response to that was, well, you can sit on it a while. Can't ride it, but you can sure sit on it for a while. But you come up with this point at which it no longer makes sense to ask why that. So for Aristotle, what is the terminus ad quem? So you start out, what is the purpose? What is the end of a human being? That's what you have to ask. What is the purpose of a human being? And the answer he comes up with is the Greek word eudaimonia. Now, a lot is going to ride on how we translate this word.
How do most people translate the word eudaimonic, the eudaimonic life? Well, most people translate it as happiness. Most scholars say that the ancient Greek word eudaimonia is Aristotle's happiness. I don't think that's a good translation, and neither does Daniel Robinson, who was also at Oxford, because happiness has to mean something more than drink up, let's have another round. That's not what he means by happiness. Now in Oklahoma, if you have a medical marijuana card, smoke another bowl and let's achieve state of euphoria. That can't be it, right? This has got to be. So Daniel Robinson says the correct translation of this word is actually the flourishing life. It's the flourishing life. What is a flourishing life? We get two different answers to this question, depending on which book you look at. In one, Aristotle says that the good life, the flourishing life, is the contemplative life. In the second, he says it's the active life, the life of the good lawgiver, for example. Now, these are two different things. If you think about it, the contemplative life is by its nature not the active life. The person who is sitting around in the lotus position thinking about philosophy is not the person who's actively engaged in the world necessarily. It takes a lot of energy to think. I mean, I as part of my job, I have to write papers that have to be peer-reviewed and published in journals. And this takes time. A lot of people wash out of higher education. A lot of my colleagues at other institutions, and even at this one, wash out of higher education because they just can't do it. It's called publish or perish. And some people, it's hard to think about these things, which is why as I look around the room, I have to do things to keep you alert and chirpy. People are falling asleep. This is hard. But that's the life Aristotle led. This is a guy who is developing systems of knowledge. The way we classify things in the natural world, kingdom, phyla, genus, species, is largely predicated on Aristotle's scholasticism. This is a guy who's studying the cuttlefish and coming up with treatise on politics and friendship and ethics, and also advising Alexander the Great. And so what you see in all of Aristotle's work, I think, is this balance between extremes, this balance and proportionality. So, for example, in the Politics, Aristotle says, unlike Plato, who Socrates says there's one ideal form of government, it's the republic, and that has the philosopher king, right? And by republic, we don't mean what we have in the United States or what we consider republican government today. What he means by republic is you have elements of monarchy, elements of aristocracy, and elements of democracy. That's what you have in republic. That's what you have in Machiavelli's discourses on the first 12 books of Titus Livia. But Aristotle looks at it differently. He was a physician by training, and he studied the natural world. And so rather than thinking that there's one form of government, he said, look, there are many types of governments. There's governments of one, there's governments of a few, and there's governments of many. And there are good governments of each of these types, and there are bad governments of each of these types. And what he says is that a good government of these types is one that governs in the interest of the governed. A bad government is one that governs in the interest of the leader or the rulers. So a good government of one is called a monarchy. A bad government of one is called a tyranny. A good government of a few is called an aristocracy. A A bad government of a few is called an oligarchy. A good government of many, what do you think it's called? That's the worst form of government, democracy. Good guess, though. He calls it a polity. Democracy is basically mob rule, right? Now, of these three, and the reason I put this up here is because what you see is this balance of portion. All of these are good, but there can be problems with them. All of these forms of government are good, but there can be problems with them. A monarchy can start out, enlightened despots, Henry VIII. Henry VIII started out as he's a pretty decent, he was influenced by the idea of elevating human beings. He'd read philosophy, he was, and then he goes spinning off the rails at some point. What was Henry VIII known for?
A bunch of wives.
Well, he kept killing them, right? I mean, they didn't have a male heir, and well, off with their head. Or he sends, Catherine of Aragon off. He divorces her. The Holy Roman Catholic Church won't let him get a divorce, so he starts his own church. It's called the Church of England, and derivatives of that church now have spread beyond England, and so this is part of the Protestant Reformation. What is the Church of England in other countries called? Well, it's a denomination here in the United States and around the world that you've heard of called Episcopalian. You all have heard of this denomination, right? And it's very close. If you were raised Roman Catholic, my father was Roman Catholic, and so I went to a Roman Catholic school. It's very close to Roman Catholicism. The common book of prayer is pretty, and the ceremony is pretty similar to Roman Catholicism. But Henry gets his divorce from Catherine of Aragon, and then he vanishes with his castle, and she dies. And he marries Anne Boleyn. She doesn't give him a son. He finds a way he trumps up charges that she was engaging in treason, and off with her head. You can see from the story of Henry, he starts out as a pretty good guy, and he ends up in pretty much the will of the king. It's very easy to degenerate into that bad form of government. If you have absolute power can corrupt absolutely. The same with democracy. If you have too many people, it's easy for one person to get a hold of them and start swaying them and become a demagogue and get them to do. People in groups will do horrible things. It's one of the reasons that they hypothesize, one of the things that may have influenced. Why is it that normal people in Nazi Germany committed horrible atrocities? It was mob psychology. You have one charismatic person who leads people astray. It's very easy to do. How many of you have been at a sporting event? One of the things that's great, you've got an OKC Thunder hoodie on back there, right? I don't know if it's still true, but at one point in time, the Chesapeake Arena was the loudest arena in the NBA. People are overwhelmingly enthusiastic. We finally got a major league sports team here, and it's amazing how you get somebody started and the crowd gets revved up, and all of a sudden they're screaming and chanting. Go to a hockey game. We used to have, before I think they're now called the Barons, but our first hockey team was called the Blazer, and they were part of the Central Hockey League. And by the way, that was the fightingest league. And I think people go to hockey games to watch the fights, not really to watch the hockey game. I was fascinated by this. And people are screaming, rip his expletive, face off. And it's fascinating to watch. Because when there's a fight that breaks out on the ice, blood, which is warm, if you get a good enough fight, will bounce on the ice. It's really, really entertaining. That's mob psychology. This middle form of government, aristocracy, That's the one Aristotle says is the least likely to become corrupted because it's got balance and proportionality. It's not one person, and it's not too many. And you're more likely to have people that will say, if one person starts to get out of hand, say, no, not going to do that. Take it back a notch, Bob. You see this in Aristotle's treatise on friendship. And I think marketers can learn a lot from Aristotle on friendship. Aristotle says there are 3 types of friendship. There are friendships that are based on utility. These are your work colleagues. How many of you have a job? Everybody in here probably has a job. How many of you had friends at your job? How many of you left a job? Did you stay friends with everybody that you at the job that you left? Some of you did. Most people don't. Most people, you leave the job and you find new friends, right? These friendships are transitory. Then there's friendship that's grounded in pleasure. These are your drinking buddies. And when you go to whiskey school, they'll tell you you have to give up your playmates and your playgrounds, right? When you go to the Betty or you go to AA, they're going to tell you you can't hang around those people anymore, right? The friendship will have to end. The friendship lasts as long. There's nothing wrong with that. Aristotle's not priggish about this. And then there's perfected friendship. These are the friends that you can count on to not only bail you out, but to help you move the body. Why do I say marketers can learn a lot? Because one of the age-old adages that I don't think is true is that you shouldn't mix business with pleasure. You shouldn't be friends with your business. I think what we teach in terms of relationship marketing is that it's important. It's important to build relationships with people. But recognize that those relationships, when you stop being useful, you're probably not, when you stop working at a company, you're not going to be friends with those people anymore, probably. You're probably going to move on, right? And your clients and your customers. If you stop, working at that company, the people that were your clients, customers before, probably you're not going to continue to have a relationship with them. But there's nothing inherently wrong with that relationship. And I would say that in a relationship world in which and we'll talk about marketing theory here in a minute, we have to recognize that relationships are important. And Aristotle says these are enormously important friendships, utility. And so our customers are enormously important, right? But this is the balance. It's not that perfected friendships, the friendship isn't useful or pleasurable. It is, but that's not the basis of the friendship. A befriends B because he wants what's best for that individual. These are the friendships, again, that you can count on one hand. Now, the reason I do all of this is because what you see through all of these works, through Aristotle's Politics, through Aristotle's Friendship, through Aristotle's Nicomachean and Eudaimonia Ethics, is this balance and proportionality of the golden mean. So Aristotle says that what we need to do, and this is a holistic approach to ethics, whereas Dooney Ethics tells us what to do in discrete situations. Don't lie to somebody. We're going to have a test come up in here, and I'm going to tell you probably are not going to want to take it. Rather than, I shouldn't lie to you. This will be an exercise in terror. No, it won't be, but but I shouldn't lie to you. It'll be, puppy dogs and rainbows, lollipops and Skittles. Yeah, don't lie. That tells us what to do in a discrete situation. Utilitarian ethics. Well, what should I do? Well, I have to have some way of evaluating you because you need a grade, so I have to do this exam, so I should give it to you, right? That's good because it's going to lead to good outcomes. That's not what Aristotle tries to do. Aristotle says, look, we need a holistic approach. In virtue ethics, it's not about telling you what to do in a particular situation. It's about creating a holistic person. It is through habituation that we become better, that we become ethical. And it is through this balance and proportionality. So what you have to do is you have to do this with all kinds of virtues. So you come up with an extreme defect of character. What's an extreme defect of character? Well, cowardice. The coward is an extreme defect of character. What is the coward? The coward is the person who never is willing to stand up for themselves or others. Right? They always run away. They avoid confrontation. What's the opposite of cowardice? It's heedlessness. The heedless person is one who engages at any provocation. I'm a lawyer. I like to fight. Right? I'm a highly confrontational individual. And on more than one occasion, I've left a courtroom and I've heard the opposing counsel use an expletive to describe me. That guy's a major, and you fill in the blank. And when it happens, I just kind of smile. Because I think, yep, I defended my client, or I prosecuted my client's case. And the fact that you don't like me has nothing to do, it has no impact on me. I probably like to engage in confrontation too much. I have a tendency to be very confrontational. That could be heedlessness. What's the balance between these two? Between somebody who's always willing to fight and the person who's never? The courageous person. I'm watching a show on the History Channel, a 3-part show right now on the History Channel on George Washington. And it's produced by Doris Kearns Goodwin, who's perhaps one of the most foremost public intellectuals and historians today. And one of the things that's remarkable, Washington faced overwhelming odds against the British in the establishment of our country. But he knew how to retreat. And he did it well, and he lived to fight another day in many instances. He saved his army. He was good at retreating, actually. He was better at retreating than he was at coming up with campaigns. But he did it long enough, and what he thought, basically, this becomes a standard for warfare and what we should learn about. And we get this in The Prince, by the way. Machiavelli's The Prince. It's very difficult to control. One of the things that we should have realized in Iraq, for example, when we went into Iraq, is that we were told, this is not going to be another Vietnam. It's become worse than Vietnam. We were told that by George W. Bush. This is not going to be another Vietnam. It's totally different than Vietnam. In Vietnam, the reason that we lost, if we did body counts during the Vietnam War of who killed more, we killed far more of them than they did of us. And if you think we won that war, you're absolutely wrong. We lost that war. And the reason that we lost the war is because it's really hard to control people on their own territory if they don't want to be controlled. And George W. Bush told us this is going to be totally different than Vietnam. In Vietnam, they were hiding in the jungles. There's no place to hide here. It's a desert. Easy, breezy, beautiful. It's still very difficult to control people if they don't want to be controlled on their own territory. Right? Very, very, very hard to do that. And that's one of the things that Washington fought in many respects a war of attrition. He kept retreating. British had to chase him. And he was good at it. But he also knew when to stand and fight. And when to make his stand and how to do it. He did that at the Delaware. His crossing of the Delaware. Brilliant. But he also knew when to retreat. Didn't retreat all the time. Crossed the Delaware. But he did know when to retreat. And he didn't always engage. So it's courage. It's this idea about, and you could do this with everything. And then what you do is you practice these things. You practice these behaviors. So, again, with regard to lying, let's think about this. The virtuous person knows when to spare somebody's feelings. Yeah, we shouldn't lie. It should be, but it's something that you should know. You shouldn't do it a lot, but there are times when it's acceptable, right? And if you practice these virtues, you will know when it's acceptable to lie. It's not okay to lie to you and tell you, like this exam that you're going to take coming up is going to be, milk and honey, sunshine and roses, right? I shouldn't lie about something like that. But, as you said, if your wife is pregnant, you don't say, you're fat. I like we're staying in tonight, honey, because, no, right? Don't do that. What are the problems with virtue ethics? Well, one of the problems that they come up with, one of the criticisms of Aristotle that philosophers come up with, and I think this one's really unfair, is how do you determine what the purpose of a human life is? How do you arrive at this? Well, I think he does a really good thing. I think he comes up with the terminus ad quem in a good rational way. I think he provides us with a pretty, but you could argue, for those people who are deeply religious, you might say that the purpose of a human life, for those of you who are Christian, is to serve God, right? That's the purpose of a human life. I think Aristotle does a good job of coming up with what the purpose of a human life, and Thomas Aquinas, by the way, who uses, Aristotle's obviously a pagan. They had this Greek pantheon of gods, right? But Thomas Aquinas, who reserves to Aristotle exclusively, and Saint Aquinas is still the official philosopher of the Holy See, uses Aristotle, and I think it's a good, I think the purpose of a human life is ultimately to flourish. We want to be successful. We want to provide for our families, the natural objects of our affection. So I think that one's a little off the mark, but that is, we could debate this. Is happiness, is the eudaimonic life really the purpose of a human life? The second criticism, and this one is more difficult, is how do you really determine what the virtues are? Where does this knowledge come from? How do you say that cowardice is really a defective character? Again, I think the rational analysis that Aristotle provides is pretty good for what these virtues are. The more difficult challenge is, can these be taught? Does anybody think that by giving Hitler a course in philosophical ethics, we would have changed, he would have gone, hallelujah, I've seen the light, I've seen the error of my ways. Can we teach these things? I'm not sure we can do. Now a case study in business ethics that is really, really old, Ken Lay and Enron. So Kenny Boy is the CEO of Enron, and Enron was just going great guns. And it turns out that Enron was a Ponzi scheme. Really. Ken Lay had a PhD in economics from the University of Texas system. Or from the state of Texas. He may have been in the A&M system. But one would hope that somewhere along the way in that training, he took a course in ethics, and it seems to not have set in. This is a smart guy, not a dummy. So it's not clear to me that we can teach the virtues. I will give you one example. I will show you one example where it did work. But again, I think that this criticism misses the mark in that you don't need a philosopher to tell you what is happening. Can we teach most people? Maybe not. But if you can teach one, if we can reach one of you, it happened in my own life. I took a course called Moral Philosophy. I didn't want to take, I took one humanities course. I took Ancient through Modern, and I decided that was enough for me. That it was just completely worthless. So I thought, well, I'll take Moral Philosophy with Doug Miller. Dr. Miller was brilliant, and it didn't sink in at first, but after a while, the things this crazy guy was saying sort of sunk in. And if I get one student, in my career, I've had thousands. 23 of my students have gone on to law school that I've written letters of recommendation for. I've kept up with all of them. Tried to talk all of them out of going to law school. I attempted to don't do that. They went anyway. If I have one student, it was probably worth it. And there's at least one example that we know of where it did work. Benjamin Franklin is a fan of virtue ethics. Oops. Let's see. Franklin, at an early age, found out that he had certain leadership characteristics. People liked to follow him. He was charismatic. He also got people into a lot of trouble. And he set about to reform himself. He is one of our favorite founding fathers. He's the only founding father, by the way, that we know of by his nickname, Ben Franklin. We don't say Tom Jefferson. They went by their full name. George Washington. Ben is the only one that we know. He came from very humble beginnings. His father was a craftsman, a renderer of soaps and candles, which is a horrible profession, by the way, because you get this stuff. You make it out of animal fat, and it smells and it's dirty to create it. He was apprenticed to his brother, who was a printer, and he rose from enormously, unlike Washington. Now, Washington, there's debate. Historians will say he came from humble beginnings, but he was a slave owner, right? I mean, his family, his father died at an early age, yes, and the family did have some struggles, but his mother was a pretty shrewd businesswoman. She taught him pretty well, and then he married Martha Washington, and that turned out really, really well. She was enormously wealthy, right? But he didn't have the education, but he certainly had it enough that some of the other founding fathers had. But Washington had a pretty good head start. Franklin, very modest beginnings. As I said, his father was a craftsman, candle maker and renderer, lye, soap, and things like that. He was apprenticed to a brother who was kind of cruel to him. And he rose to prominence to become one of the preeminent thinkers, doers, and politicians, a brilliant businessman. He became enormously wealthy. He invented all kinds of things that we still use to this day. Things like bifocals, the Franklin stove. He did experiments on electricity. As a result, he came up with a lightning rod that saved thousands and thousands of buildings. But as I said, he noticed that he had certain leadership qualities. For example, one of the stories that he tells in his autobiography is about how he was a leader of boys. And there was a house that was going to be built, and there were some stones that had been delivered to build the house. And they decided that, well, they would just use those stones to go fishing. They'd make a little wharf out into the river so that they could go fish. They got caught. Franklin's father admonishes him that nothing is worthwhile that isn't honorable. So he set about reforming himself. He came up with 13 virtues. Why are there 13? Well, because you can get through 4 complete cycles in a year. It's the same reason that historically on television, when I was growing up, it's no longer the case, but historically, seasons of sitcoms and shows had 13 episodes. You could have a fall lineup, a spring lineup, and go through 2 complete series of reruns, because if you multiply 13 by 4, you come up with what? You can do the math on each other. 52. How many weeks are there in a year? 52, right? So you could get through 4 complete cycles in a year. And he put them down. He had a little piece of ivory. And if he had what he called were spots, he knew there was more work to do. This is one of the things about Franklin. It's amazing. He didn't view things as being deeply troubling. You could reform yourself. Unlike Rousseau, who was deeply conflicted and thought, you were scarred for life by these things. Franklin, every day was a new day that you could try something. Temperance, eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation. Silence, speak not but what benefits yourself. Others, avoid trifling conversation. Avoid gossip, in other words, right? Order, let all things have their place. Let each part of your business have its time. Resolution, resolve to perform that which you ought perform without fail. Frugality, industry. This one I really love. Chastity. Rarely use venery. That's an old word for sex. But for offspring, never to dullness, weakness, or the injury of another's health or reputation. Humility, imitate Jesus and Socrates. And it worked. Seems to have worked. I'm out of time. So we will pick up with this. Is it in the schedule that we have Thursday off? Is that right? So since it's in the schedule, we'll do that. Because I was supposed to be going to the competition. Is that right? Is that what we have in the schedule?
Yeah, that was what I asked.
All right. So what I will probably do is I will have the first exam. I'll give you Thursday to work on that, and I will post it on D2L. It will be a take-home, open note, open book. You'll have an essay. It'll be essays and some multiple choice that you'll have to do. So that'll be on Thursday. We've gotten through all of the first part, or the philosophical part of this. We will talk next time, or when we come back on Tuesday, a week from today, we'll talk about marketing theory and how you apply these things to marketing. So we'll email out for the first exam. We won't have class on Thursday, and I will see you guys a week from today.
Does the exam open and close on Thursday?
Yeah, okay. Sounds easy. Thank you. What's that?
Thank you. Enjoy your weekend.
Thanks.